Ranger's Apprentice, Book 2, The Burning Bridge, by John Flanagan. Chapter 18. Following the wargals was easier than they expected. The creatures were single-minded, concentrating only on the task in hand, which was to take the Celts miners to their end destination. They feared no attack in these parts, having already driven the occupants out, so they posted no forward scouts or sweepers. Their constant chanting, ominous as it might sound at first, also served to mask any sounds that might have been made by their pursuers. At night, they simply camped wherever they might find themselves to be. The miners remained chained together and sentries were posted to keep watch over them while the rest of the group slept. By the beginning of the second day, Will began to have an idea of the direction the wargals were heading. He had been riding some 30 meters in the lead, relying on Tuck to sense any danger ahead. Now he dropped back a little, waiting for Horace and Evanlyn to come level with him. "We seem to be heading for the fissure," he said, more than a little puzzled. Already in the distance, they could make out the high, brooding cliffs that towered over the other side of the massive split in the earth. Celtica itself was a mountainous country, but Morgarath's domain reared hundreds of meters above. "I wouldn't care to come down those cliffs on ropes and scaling ladders," Horace said, nodding toward them. "Even if you did, you had to find a level space on the other side to cross from," Will agreed. "And apparently there are precious few of them. For the most part of the cliffs go right down to the bottom." Evanlyn looked from one to the other. "Yes, Morgarath has done it once. Maybe he's planning to attack Ireland the same way," she said. Horace brought his horse to a halt. Considering what she had said, Will and Evanlyn stopped beside him. He chewed his lip for a few seconds as he thought back over the lessons that Sir Rodney instructed had dined into him. Then he shook his head. "It's a different situation," he said finally. "The attack on Celtica was more of a raid than an invasion. He wouldn't have needed more than 500 men for that, and they could travel light. To attack Ireland, he'll need an army, and he wouldn't get an army down those cliffs and across with a few ladders and rope bridges." Will regarded him with interest. This was a side of Horace that was new to him. Apparently, Horace's learning curve in the past 7 or 8 months had gone beyond his mere skill with the sword. "But surely, if he had enough time," he began. But Horace shook his head again, more decisively this time. "Men, oh yes, or wargals in this case. Given enough time, you could get them down and across. It would take months, but you could manage it. Although the longer it took, the more chance would be to get word out about what you're doing. But an enemy needs equipment, heavy weapons, supply wagons, provisions, tents, spare weapons and blacksmith's equipment to repair them, horses and oxes to pull the wagons. You never get all that down those cliffs like those. And even if you did, how would you get it across? It's just not feasible. Sir Carol used to say that..." He realized that the others were regarding him curiously, and he flushed. I didn't mean to go on," he mumbled, and urged his horse forward again. But as Will followed, he was shaking his head, impressed by his friend's grasp on the subject. "Not at all," he said. "You're making good sense." "Which still leaves us the question, what is he up to?" Evanlyn said. Will shrugged. "I suppose we'll find out soon enough," he said, and urged Tuck forward to take up the point position once more. They found out the following evening. As before, they heard the first hint as to what was taking place, the ring of thought of hammer striking stone or wood. Then there was a noise as they drew closer, a constant but irregular cracking sound. Will signals for the others to stop, and dismounting, he proceeded carefully along the last stretch of the road to the final bend. Shrouded in his cloak and moving carefully from one patch of cover to the next, he moved off the road and cut across the country to find a vantage point from which to view the next stretch of road. Almost immediately, he saw the top of a massive wooden structure that was being constructed. 4 wooden towers, linked by heavy rope cables and a timber framework, reared above the surrounding countryside. His heart sinking, he already knew what he was looking at, but he moved closer just to make sure. It was as he feared. An immense wooden bridge was the final stages of construction. On the far side of the fissure, Morgarath had discovered one of the few places where a narrow ledge ran almost level with the Celtic side. The natural ledge had been dug out and widened until there was a sizable piece of level ground there. The 4 towers stood to either side of the fissure, linked by massive rope cables. Supported by them, a wooden roadway was half completed, capable of taking 6 men abreast across the dizzying depths of the fissure. Figures, recognizable as Celt prisoners, swarmed over the construction, hammering and sawing. The cracking sound was made by the whips used by the wargal overseers. Beyond them, the sound of hammers and stone came from the mouth of the tunnel that opened onto the ledge some 50 meters south of the bridge. It was little more than a crack in the cliff face, only a little wider than a man's shoulders. But as you watched, the Celt prisoners were hard at work at its entrance, gauging at the hard rock, widening and enlarging the small opening. All glanced up at the dark cliffs towering on the other side. There was no sign of ropes or ladders leading down the ledge. The wargals and their prisoners must access it via the narrow crack in the rock, he reasoned. The party they had been following were crossing the fissure now. The final 15 meters of road was yet to be constructed, and only a temporary timber footway was in place. It was barely wide enough for the Celts to cross, tethered in pairs as they were. But the mind of the Celtica were used to awkward footing and dizzying drops, and they crossed without incident. He'd seen enough for the time being, he thought. It was time to get back. He wriggled his way backward into the cover of the broken rocks. Then, bending almost double, he ran back to where the others were waiting. When he reached them, he slumped down, leaning back against the rocks. The tension of the last 2 days was beginning to tell on him, along with the strain of being in command. He was a little surprised to realize that he was physically exhausted. He had no idea that mental tension could sap a person's strength so thoroughly. "So, what's going on? Did you see anything?" Horace said. Will looked at him warily. "A bridge," he told him. "They're building a huge bridge." Horace frowned, puzzled by it all. "A bridge? Why would Morgarath want a bridge?" "It's a huge bridge," I said. "Big enough to bring an army across. Here we've been discussing how Morgarath couldn't move an army and all his equipment down the cliffs and across the fissure, and all the time he's been building a bridge to do just that." Evanlyn picked up a loose thread in her jacket. "That's why he wanted the Celts," she said. When both boys looked at her, she elaborated. "They're expert builders and tunnelers. His wargals wouldn't have the skill for the undertaking like this." "They're tunneling too," Will said. "There's a narrow crack, sort of a cave mouth in the far side of their widening." "Where does it lead to?" Horace asked, and Will shrugged. "I don't know. It might be important to find out. After all, the plateau on the other side is still hundreds of feet above the point. But there must be some access between the two, because there's no sign of ropes or ladders." Horace stood and began to pace back and forth as he considered this new information. His face was screwed up in thought. "I don't get it," he said finally. "It's not that hard to get, Horace," Will told him with some asperity. "There's a bargain great bridge being built over the fissure, big enough for Morgarath and all his wargals, and the supply wagons, and the blacksmith, and their oxen, and Uncle Tom Copley and all to come waltzing over." Horace waited until we had finished his tirade. He was outwardly calm, but Evanlyn could see a slight flush of anger on his face. He let the awkward silence stretch between them for some time, then said in a deceptively quiet tone, "You're quite finished, are you?" Will shifted uncomfortably in the saddle, realizing he might have gone too far. Well, yes," he said, making a vaguely apologetic gesture for Horace to continue. "What I don't get," Horace said, enunciating very carefully and with heavy emphasis, "is why it was never mentioned in those plans you captured." Evanlyn looked up curiously. "Plans? What plans?" But Will gestured for her to wait for the explanation. He realized that Horace had made a vital point, and the sarcastic response he had been planning was instantly dispelled. "You're right. The plans never mentioned a bridge across the fissure. And it's not as if it's a small undertaking. You think it would be in there somewhere," Horace said. Will nodded in agreement. Evanlyn, her curiosity thoroughly piqued by now, repeated her question. "What are these plans you keep talking about?" Holt took pity on her. Will and Holt, his craftmaster, captured a copy of Morgarath's battle plans a couple of weeks ago. There was a lot of detail about how his forces are going to break out of the mountain via Three-Step Pass. There was even the date on which they were going to do it and how Scandian mercenaries were going to help them. Only, there was no mention of this bridge. "Why not?" Evanlyn asked. but Will was beginning to see what Morgarath had in mind, and his horror was growing by the second. Unless, he said, Morgarath wanted us to capture those plans. That's crazy, Horace said instantly. After all, one of his men died as a result. Will met his gaze evenly. Will that stop Morgarath? He doesn't care about other people's lives. Let's think it through. Holt has a saying, when you can't see the reason for something, look for the possible result and ask yourself, who might benefit from it? So, said Evanlyn, what's the result of you finding those plans? Well, King Duncan has moved the army to the plains of Ulfal to block Three-Step Pass, said Horace promptly. Evanlyn nodded and continued with the second part of the equation. And who might benefit from that? Will looked up at her. He could see she'd reached the same conclusion he had, and at the very same time, very slowly he said, Morgarath, those plans were false. Evanlyn nodded in agreement. Horace was not quite so quick to see the point. False? What do you mean? I mean, said Will, Morgarath wanted us to find those plans. He wanted the Erenland army assembled at the plains of Uthal, the whole army, because Three-Step Pass isn't where the real attack will come from. The real attack will come from here, a surprise attack from behind, and our army will be trapped and then destroyed. Horace's eyes widened in horror. He could envisage the result of a massive attack from the rear. The Erenlands would be caught between the Scandians and wargals in the front of them and another army of wargals in their rear. It was a recipe for disaster, the kind of disaster every general feared. Then we got to tell them, he said. Right away. Will nodded. We got to tell them. But there's one more thing I want to see. That tunnel they're digging. We don't know if it's finished or half finished or where it goes. I want to take a look at it tonight. But Horace was shaking his head before he even finished. Well, we got to go now. We can't hang around here just to satisfy your curiosity, he said. It was Evanlyn who solved the argument. You're right, Horace. The king must know about this as soon as possible. But we have to be sure that we're not taking him on another red herring. The tunnel Will's talking about could be weeks away from completion, or it could lead to a dead end. This whole thing could be yet another ruse to convince the army to divert forces to protect their rear. We have to find out as much as possible. If that means waiting for a few more hours, then I say we wait. Will glanced at the girl curiously. She certainly seemed to have a better grasp of strategy than one would expect from a lady's maid. There was an unmistakable air of authority about her as well. He decided that Gillen's theory was correct. It'll be dark in an hour, Horace. We'll go across tonight and take a closer look. Horace looked from one of his companions to the other. He wasn't happy. His instinct was to ride now as fast as he could and spread the word of the bridge. But he was outvoted, and he still believed Will's powers of deduction were better than his own. He was trained for action, not this sort of torturous thinking. Reluctantly, he allowed himself to be convinced. All right, we'll look tonight, but tomorrow we leave. Wrapped in his cloak and moving carefully, Will returned to his former vantage point. He studied the bridge carefully, thinking that Holt would expect him to be able to draw an accurate plan of the structure. He hadn't been in position for more than 10 minutes when a horn blast rang out. He froze, terrified. For a moment he thought it was an alarm, and that an alert sentry had spotted him moving among the rocks. But then he heard more cracking of wisps and grunting cries of the wargals, and as he raised his head, he saw that they were driving the Celts off the bridge and back towards the half-finished tunnels. The prisoners, as they went, downed their tools in stacks. Wargals began to reshackle them to the central leash. Glancing up to the west, Will saw the last curve of the sun dropping behind the hills, and he realized that the horn had simply been sounding to end the working day. Now the prisoners were being returned to wherever it was they were kept. There was one brief altercation a few meters from the tunnel's mouth, as two of the Celt prisoners stopped to try to lift the prone figure that lay there. Angrily, the wargal guards surged forward, beating the miners away with their whips and forcing them to leave the still figure where it lay. Then, one after the other, they filed through the narrow entrance of the tunnel and disappeared. The shadows of the huge bridge lengthened across the hillside. Will remained unmoving for another 10 minutes, waiting to see if any wargals re-emerged from the tunnel. But there was no sound, no sign of anyone returning. Only still form lying by the tunnel mouth remained. In the rapidly worsening light, Will couldn't make it out clearly. It looked like the body of a miner, but he couldn't be sure. Then the figure moved, and he realized that whoever it was still alive. Chapter 19. Treading carefully, Will and Horace made their way across the narrow plank path that bridged the last 50 meters of the fissure. Will, with his excellent head for heights, could have run lightly across it without a problem, but he went slowly out of regard for his bigger, less nimble friend. When they finally made it into the finished roadway, Horace heaved a sigh of relief. Now they took a moment to examine the structure. It was built with all the thoroughness that cults were famous for. As a nation, they developed the art of tunneling and bridging over the centuries. And this was a typical sturdy structure. The smell of fresh sawn pine planking filled the cold night air, and overlaid on that, there was another sweetish aromatic smell. They looked at each other puzzled for a moment. Then Horace recognized it. "Tar," he said, and he looked around to see that the massive rope cables and support ropes were thick with the stuff. Will touched a hand on one, and it came away sticky. "I guess it prevents the ropes from fraying and rotting," he said carefully, noticing that the main cables were constructed of 3 heavy ropes, twisted and played together, then thickly coated with the tar to protect them. Also, as the tar hardened, it would bind the 3 together more permanently. Horace glanced around. "No guards?" he commented. There was a disapproving note in his voice. "They're either very confident or very careless," Will agreed. It was full night now, and the moon was yet to rise. Will moved towards the eastern bank of the fissure, loosening his sword in its scabbard. Horace followed him. The figure by the tunnel mouth lay as Will had last seen it. There had been no further sign of movement. The 2 boys approached him carefully now and knelt beside him. For now they could see that it was a Celt miner. His chest rose and fell, barely moving. "He's alive," Will whispered. "Only just," Horace replied. He placed his forefinger to the Celt's neck to gauge the pulse there. At the touch, the man's eyes slowly opened, and he gazed up at 2 of them, uncomprehending. "Who you?" he managed to croak. Will unslung the water bottle from his shoulder and moistened the man's lips with a little of the liquid. The tongue moved greedily across the wetness, and the man croaked again, trying to raise on one elbow. "More." Gently, Will stopped him from moving and gave him a little more water. "Rest easy, friend," he said softly. "We're not going to harm you." It was obvious that somebody had done him harm, and plenty of it. His face was matted with the dry blood that had welled from a dozen whip cuts. His leather jerkin was shredded and torn, and his bare torso underneath showed signs of more whipping, recent and from long ago. "Who are you?" Will asked softly. "Glendis," the man sighed, seeming to wonder at the sound of his own name. Then he coughed, a racking, rattling cough that shook his chest. Will and Horace exchanged sad glances. Glendis didn't have long, they both realized. "When did you come here?" Will asked the man, gently allowing more water to trickle through the dried, cracked lips. "Months," Glendis replied in a voice they could barely hear. "Months and months ago, I've been here, working on the tunnel." Again the 2 boys looked at one another. Maybe the man's mind was wandering. "Months?" Will pressed him. "But the wargal attack only started a month ago, surely?" But Glendis was shaking his head. He tried to speak, coughed and subsided, gathering his fading strength. And he spoke so softly that Will and Horace had to lean closer to him. "They took us almost a year ago, from all over, secretly. A man here, 2 men there, 50 of us in all. Most of the others dead by now. Me, soon." He stopped, grasping for breath again. The effort of speaking was almost too much for him. Will and Horace looked at each other, puzzled over this new information. "How was it that nobody knew this was happening?" Horace asked his friends. "I mean, 50 people go missing, and nobody says anything?" But Will shook his head. He said they took them from villages all over Celtica, so 1 or 2 men go missing. People might talk about it locally, but nobody could see the entire picture. "Still, why do it?" Why are they so about it now? Will shrugged. Maybe we'll get an idea of that when we take a look around. They hesitated, uncertainly not sure what they could do for the crumpled, battered form beside them. They waited. The moon rose, soaring over the hills and flooding the bridge and the bank with soft, pale light. It touched on Glenda's face, and his eyes opened, and he tried weakly to raise her on an arm to ward off the light. Gently, Will leaned forward to shield him. "I'm dying," said the miner with a sudden clarity and a sense of peace. Will hesitated, then answered simply, "Yes." It would have been no kindness to lie to him, to try to cheer him along and protest that he would be all right. He was dying, and they all knew it. Better to let him prepare, to let him face death with dignity and calm. The hand clutched feebly at Will's sleeve, and he took it in his own, pressing it gently, letting the Celt feel the contact with another person. "Don't let me die out here in the light." Again Horace and Will exchanged glances. "I want the peace of the out of light," continued softly, and Will suddenly understood. I guess Celts like the darkness. They spend most of their lives in the tunnel and mines after all. Maybe that's what he wants. Horace leaned forward. "Glenda's," he said, "do you want us to carry you into the tunnel?" The miner's head had swiveled to Horace's as the boy spoke. Now he nodded faintly, just enough for them to make out the action. "Please," he whispered, "take me to the out of light." Horace nodded to him, then slipped his arm under the Celt's shoulders and knees to lift him. Glenda's was small-boned, and the weeks he had spent in captivity had obviously been a time of starvation for him. He was an easy burden for Horace to lift. As the warrior apprentice stood straight with Glenda's, he cradled in his arms. Will motioned for him to wait. He sensed that once Glenda's was in the peace of the dark tunnel, he would let go of the faint thread that held him to life. And there was still one more question Will needed answers. "Glenda's?" he said softly. "How long do we have?" The miner looked at him warily, uncomprehending. Will tried again. "How long before they finished the bridge?" he asked. This time he could see a light of understanding in the Celt's eyes. Glenda's thought for a second or two. 5 days, he replied. "Maybe 4. More workers came today, so maybe 4. Then his eyes closed, as if the effort had been too much. For a second they thought he had died, but then his chest heaved with a massive shudder and he continued to breathe. "Let's get him into the tunnel," Will said. They squeezed through the narrow opening. For the first 10 meters the walls of the tunnel were close enough to touch. Then they began to widen, as the result of the Celt's labor became evident. It was a dark, confined place, lit only by the dim flames of torches set in brackets every 10 to 12 meters. Some of these were guttering now, and provided only a fitful, uncertain light. Horace looked around uneasily. He didn't like heights, and he definitely didn't like confined spaces. "Here's the answer," Will said. "Morgarath needed those first 50 miners to do this work. Now that the tunnel is nearly finished, he needs more men to get the bridge built as quickly as possible." Horace nodded. "You're right," he agreed. "The tunneling would take months, but nobody would see what's going on. Once they started building the bridge, the risk of discovery would be much higher." In the wider reaches of the tunnel, they found a small sandy patch, almost a grotto off to one side. They let Glenda's in it. Will realized that this must have been what the 2 Celts had been trying to do for their countrymen when the stop-work horn had sounded. He hesitated. "I wonder what the wargals will think when they find him here tomorrow." Horace merely shrugged. "Maybe they'll think he crawled in here by himself," he suggested. Will thought about it doubtfully, but then he looked at the peaceful expression on the dying miner's face in the gloomy light, and he couldn't bring himself to take the man back outside once more. "Just put him in a little further, as far out of sight as you can," he said. There was a small elbow of the rock, and Horace gently placed the miner behind it. He was now visible only if you looked carefully, and Will decided that was good enough. Horace stepped back into the main tunnel. Will noticed that he was still glancing uneasily around. "What do we do now?" he asked. Will came to a decision. "You can wait here for me. I'm going to see where this leads." Horace didn't argue. The thought of going further into the dark, winding tunnel didn't appeal to him at all. He found a place to sit, closer to one of the brighter torches. "Just make sure you come back," he said. I don't want to have to come looking for you. Chapter 20. The tunnel, level at first, began to angle steeply upward as Will went on, leaving Horace behind him. The walls and floors showed evidence of the Celts' picks and drills, as they had torn and gouged at the rock to widen the path. Will guessed that the original narrow tunnel had been nothing more than a natural fault in the rock, a mere crevice. But as he went on, he saw how much it had been widened, until there was room for 4 or 5 men to walk abreast, and still it climbed up into the heart of the mountains. A circle of light showed the end of the tunnel. He estimated that he traveled maybe 300 meters in total, and then was another 40 away. The light that he could see seemed to be stronger than simple moonlight, and as he carefully emerged from the tunnel, he saw why. Here, the hills separated, forming a large valley about 200 meters across and half a kilometer long. To one side, the moonlight showed him massive wooden structures leading up to the higher reaches of the plateau, staircases he realized after a few moments' study. The floor of the valley was lit with campfires, and there were hundreds of figures moving in the flickering orange light. Will guessed that this would be the assembly area for Morgarath's army. At the moment, it was where the wargals kept their Celt prisoners at night. He paused, trying to form a picture of the overall situation. The plateau that formed the greater part of Morgarath's domain was still at least 50 meters above this point, but the staircases and the less formidable slope of the surrounding hills would provide relatively easy access down to this valley. The valley itself must be some 30 meters above the level where the bridge stood. The sloping tunnel would take troops down to the bridge from here. Once again, Holt's words echoed in his ear. Nowhere is really impassable. He moved to the left of the tunnel, mouthed and found a cover in a jumble of rocks and boulders, while he took stock of the situation. There was a rough stockade in the center of the valley. Inside the wooden fencing, he could see a large number of small fires, each with a group of figures seated or sprawled around it. This was a prisoner's compound, he guessed. Large fires outside the compound marked the places where the wargals were camped. He could see the hulking, shambling forms clearly against the firelight as they moved around. Yet there was one fire close to him that seemed different. The figures seemed more upright, more humanoid in a way they stood and carried themselves. Curiously, he worked his way closer to it, sliding through the night with barely a sound, moving quickly from one patch of cover to the next, until he was just out of the outer ring of light thrown by the fire, a spot where he knew the darkness by contrast. It would seem more intense to those sitting around the fire here. There was a hunch of some kind of meat roasting slowly over the fire, and the smell of it sets his mouth watering. He'd been traveling for days on cold rations, and the meat filled the air with a delicious fragrance. He felt his stomach begin to rumble, and fear stepped through him. It would be unthinkably bad luck to be betrayed by a rumbling stomach, he thought. The fear did the trick, killing his appetite. His digestion more or less under control, he edged his face around a boulder, low to the ground, to get a better look at the figures eating by the fire. As he did so, one of them leaned forward to slice off a chunk of the meat, juggling the hot, greasy food in his hand as he took it. The movement let the firelight shine clearly on him, and Will could see that these were not wargals. From their rough sheepskin vests, woolen leggings, bound with tapes and heavy seal fur boots, he recognized them as Scandians. Further study showed him their horned helmets, round wooden shields, and battle axes piled to one side of the campsite. He wondered what they were doing here, so far from the ocean. The man who had moved finished his meat and wiped his hands on his sheepskin vest. He belched, then settled himself in a more comfortable spot by the fire. "Be damn glad when all waxmen get here," he said in the thick, almost indecipherable accent of Scandia. Will knew that Scandians spoke the same tongue as the kingdom. Hearing it now for the first time, though, he barely recognized it. The other sea-wolves growled their agreement. There were 4 of them around the fire. Will edged forward a little to hear more clearly, then froze horrified as he saw the unmistakable shambling from a wargal moving directly towards him from the other side of the fire. The Scandians heard him coming and looked up warily. With an immense feeling of relief, Will realized that the creature was not coming toward him, but was approaching the Scandians' fire. "Hola," said one of the Scandians in a low voice. "Here comes one of Morgarath's beauties." The wargal had stopped on the far side of the fire. He grunted something unintelligible at the group of sea raiders. The one who just spoken shrugged. "Sorry, handsome. Didn't catch that," he said. There was an obvious note of hostility in his voice. The wargal seemed to sense it. He repeated his statement, growing angry now. Again the circle of Scandian warriors shrugged at him. The wargal grunted again, growing angrier by the minute. He gestured at the meat hanging over the fire, then at himself. He shouted at the Scandians now, making eating gestures. "Ugly brute wants our venison," said one of the Scandians. There were a low growl of dissent from the group. "They don't catch his own," said the first man. The wargal stepped inside the circle now. He had stopped shouting. He simply pointed to the meat, then turned his red glaring eyes on the speaker. Somehow the silence was more menacing than his shouting had been. "Careful, Erak," warned one of the Scandians. "We are outnumbered here at the moment." Erak scowled at the wargal for a second, then seemed to realize the wisdom of his friend's advice. He gestured angrily at the meat. "Go on then, take it," he said coldly. The wargal stepped forward and snatched the wooden spit from the fire, taking a huge bite at the meat and tearing a large chunk loose. Even from where he was lying, scarcely daring to breathe, Will could see the ugly light of triumph in the red animal eyes. Then the wargal turned abruptly and bounded out of the circle, forcing several of the Scandians to move hurriedly aside to avoid being trampled on. They heard his guttural laugh as he faded into the darkness. "Damn things give me the heebies," muttered Erak. "Don't know why we have to have something to do with them." "'Cause Hoff don't trust Morgarath," one of the others told him. "If we are not along, these damn bearmen will keep all the plunder for themselves, and we'll get is a hard fight at the plains of Uthal. And hard marching too," put another one. "Wouldn't be any fun with horsemen either working their way around Thorn Tree Forest to take the enemy in the rear. That's rough going, alright." Will frowned as he heard that. Obviously Morgarath and Hoth, who Will assume was a Scandian war leader, were planning another treacherous surprise for the kingdom's forces. He tried to picture a map of the countryside around the plains of Uthal, but his memory was sketchy. He wished he'd paid more attention to the geography lessons Holt had taught him. "Why is geography so important?" he remembered asking his teacher. "Because maps are important, if you want to know where your enemy is and where he's going," had been the reply. Glumly, Will realized now how right he had been. Holt had shaken his head at him, then, in that mock-serious way he had. Suddenly thinking of his wise and capable teacher, Will felt very lonely, and more than a little out of his depth. "Anyway," Erik was saying, "things will be different when Olruk's men get here, although they seem to be taking their damn time about it." "Relax," said the other speaker. "It'll take a few days to get 500 men up them south cliffs. Think how long it took us." "Yeah," said another, "but we were blazing a trail. All they have to do is follow it." "Well, they can't get here too soon for me," said Erak, rising and stretching. "I'm for Seablads just as soon as I've done the necessaries." "Well, don't do 'em here by fire," said one of the others irritably. "Go up behind them rocks there." Horrified, Will realized that the Scandians had gestured toward the rocks where he was hiding, and now Erak, laughing at the other man, was turning and heading his way. It was definitely time to go. He scuttled backwards a few meters, then, crawling rapidly on his stomach, used all his training and natural skill to blend with the available cover. He'd gone perhaps 20 meters when he heard a splashing sound from the spot where he'd been eavesdropping. Then he heard a contented sigh, and looked back, saw the shaggy-haired form of the Erak silhouette against the glow of the 100 or so campfires in the valley. Realizing that the Scandian was intent on what he was doing, Will slipped through the darkness and back into the tunnel. He went carefully for the first few meters, allowing his eyes to become accustomed to the dim light of the torches. Then he began to run, his soft hide boots making barely a noise on the sandy floor. Chapter 21. He had found Horace waiting for him, his hand ready on his sword hilt where he had left him in the tunnel. "Did you find out anything?" the apprentice warrior whispered hoarsely. Will let go a pent-up breath, realizing he'd been holding it for some time now. "Plenty," he said. "All of it bad." He held up a hand to forestall Horace's further questions. "Let's get back to across the bridge." "I'll tell you then," he said. He glanced into the side tunnel where they left the Celt miner. "Have you heard anything more from Glendis?" he asked. Horace shrugged sadly. "He started moaning about an hour ago, then he went quiet. I think he's dead. At least he died the way he wanted to, he said. Then he followed Will back through the dimly lit tunnel to the bridge. They made their way across the planking again, to where Evanlyn waited with the horses. Will back from the bridge and out of the sight. When they were close, Will called her name softly, so as to avoid startling her. Horace had left his dagger with Evanlyn, and Will thought an armed Evanlyn would not be a person to approach unexpectedly. As he described the scene as the other end of the tunnel, he hastily scratched a map in the sand for them. Somehow, we're going to have to find a way to delay Morgarath's forces, he said. The other two looked at him curiously. Delay them? How could two apprentices and a girl delay 500 Scandians and several thousand relentless wargals? I thought you said we should get word to the king, Evanlyn said. We don't have time anymore, Will said simply. Look. They leaned forward as he smoothed over the diagram he had drawn in the sand and hastily sketched out a new one. He wasn't sure that it was totally accurate, but at least it included the most important features of the kingdom as well as the southern plateau where Morgarath ruled. They said there are more Scandians coming up the cliffs on the south coast to join the wargals we'd already seen. They'll cross the fissure here, where we are, and move north to attack the barons in the rear, where they'll wait for Morgarath to try and break out a 3-step pass. Yes, said Horace, we know that. We guessed it as soon as we saw the bridge. Will looked up at him, and Horace fell silent. He realized the ranger's apprentice had something else to say. But, said Will, emphasizing the word and pausing for a moment, I also heard them saying something about Horace and his men marching around Thorntree Forest. That's up here to the north of the plains of Uthal. Evanlyn grasped the point immediately, which would bring the Scandians northwest of the king's army. They'd be trapped between the wargals and Scandians who have crossed the bridge and the other forces from the north. Exactly, said Will, meeting her gaze. They could both appreciate how dangerous the situation would be for the assembled barons. Expecting a Scandian attack through the Fenlands to the east, they'd be taken by surprise from not one, but two different directions, caught between the arms of a pincer and crushed. Then we'd better warn the king surely, insisted Horace. Horace, said Will patiently, it would take us 4 days to reach the plains. Even more reason to get going. We haven't a moment to waste, said the young warrior. And then, put in Evanlyn, seeing Will's point, it would take at least another 4 days for any sort of force to get back here and hold the bridge. Maybe more. That's 8 days in total, said Will. Remember what that poor miner said. The bridge will be ready in 4 days' time. The wargals and Scandians will have had plenty of time to cross the fissure, assemble in battle formation, and attack the king's army. But, Horace began, and Will interrupted him. Horace, even if we get the warning to the king and the barons, they'll be badly outnumbered, and they'll be caught between two forces, with no way to retreat. The swarms of the Fenlands will be behind them. Now I know we have to get a warning to them, but we can also do something here to even the numbers. Plus, Evanlyn put in, and Horace turned to face her. If we can do something to stop the wargals and Scandians from crossing here, the king will have the advantage over his northern force of Scandians. Horace nodded. They won't be outnumbered, I guess, he said. Evanlyn nodded, but then added, it's part of it. But those Scandians will be expecting reinforcements to attack the king from the rear. Reinforcements that will never arrive. Understanding dawned on Horace's eyes. He nodded slowly, several times. Then the frown returned. But what can we do to stop the wargals here? Will and Evanlyn exchanged a glance. He could see they'd come to the same conclusion. They both spoke at the same time. We burn the bridge.